Thanks so much, everyone here at the museum, and to all of you. It's great to see everyone. This is so awesome. I'm going to press start. I have to confess that kind of midway through my talk, I'm going to do a bit of a bait and switch. I am going to be talking about wartime morale and popular culture, but we're going to pay attention to how it plays out in a very different oceanic realm with sharks. Okay, so we're gonna go, we're gonna start now. All right. Okay, so on December 7th, 1941, Marion Breidenbaugh she was at home in El Centro, California, just outside of El Centro. She was the daughter of farmers, and she was preparing a mid-morning snack, and the radio crackled to life with the ongoing attack at Pearl Harbor. And she scrambled outside to tell her father, who was working in a distant field with his crew. She hopped over all sorts of vegetables, cabbages, carrots, lettuce, and a very large sunning California king snake. And she finally reached her father. "Father, father!" And she told him what had happened. He jumped on his tractor and he hurried home. Here she is, a little bit earlier in life. She's my aunt, and she's 93 years old, and she still remembers this like it happened yesterday. And this, news in the Imperial Valley, arid, irrigated farmland, she learned it on the radio, and the radio, of course, was just a tremendously important instrument of entertainment, information, and dissemination. And of course, during President Roosevelt's 4-year presidency, he used the radio as an intimate bullhorn in his fireside chats. As well, when we think about the radio, we can think about the Voice of America, which was started in 1942, and it broadcast in over 40 languages 24/7 around the world, again, disseminating American ideas. And so very much important, but also the radio was a source of entertainment, of course. And one big hit from 1943 was Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition. It reached #1 on the Billboard charts. And the story goes that this song was inspired by a chaplain at Pearl Harbor who walked the ammunition line as everything was happening, as the attack is unfolding. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition as he's walking that ammunition line. I can only imagine that sort of epic scene. And during World War II, the Roosevelt administration deployed popular culture to consolidate public support for the war effort, including the morale-boosting potential of older entertainments, such as the circus. So I've written a lot about circuses, so I had to include something on the circus here, because actually, there were, pretty severe restrictions on railroad conveyance during World War II. And so President Roosevelt gave a special dispensation to the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus because he saw it as a morale-boosting institution. Now, its famous punctuality was pretty severely limited because, of course, if there were trains that were bringing troops or wartime supplies, they always got the right of way. So the circus, for the first time, was very late, a lot during World War II. And there's a whole other bunch of stories connected to it, but it is one of the forms of popular culture that was very much an important source of morale boosting during the war. And the success of this campaign, this mobilization campaign culturally to fight a vast two-front war, was an extraordinary cultural milestone in American history. I keep turning to it And it's hard to fathom in today's ever-proliferating profusion of social media platforms and kind of, different fake news sources and this and that. It's hard to imagine. And both, in this period of World War II, of course, and other speakers have addressed this really beautifully, the Office of War Information was a really important government agency that worked hand in hand with private culture industry producers to produce and to, censor in some cases, but had played an active hand. The government played an active hand in the kind of messaging and popular production that went on during this period. This was done by Executive Order 9182, June 13th, 1942, which also created a kind of another organization, which was the Office of Strategic Services, which also was very vested in propaganda and information, but more focused on intelligence gathering and also a propensity on occasion for disinformation as well. We're going to learn more about that disinformation side of the OSS a little bit later in today's talk. And so there was just a range of, different ways in which the OWI and the OSS worked. And as Rob mentioned in his talk, looking at the Bureau of Motion Pictures part of the OWI, very involved in all sorts of different movie production, commenting on scripts, shaping every aspect. So I'll just show you a few of the films. Of course, there were over 200, as we learned today. And these were all subjected to this kind of oversight of production. And Emily Rosenberg, the historian, she observes that the BMP, quote, denied licenses to films that portrayed labor or class conflict or presented American life as violent, cynical, idle, or lavish, unquote. And so this, as I mentioned, the OWI was very much a propaganda arm of the government, and Elmer Davis, who was in charge of the OWI, he was very proud of the fact that this was a disseminator of accurate information. And the two agencies together, the OWI and the OSS, worked collaboratively also with other organizations like the Office of Price Administration to stabilize the economy, conserve the nation's food supply, and to prevent black market gouging. And I have a few images. Victory Gardens, we've seen some of those images before. Our food is fighting. Every garden, a munitions plant. My late parents, they both had Victory Gardens in their respective homes in California. My dad, he used to tell me stories about how he would pluck black widow spiders out of his Victory Garden and put them in his sister's room. Not nice, not nice. This was in Millbrae, California. He remembered it really till the end of his life. This image we saw, the shadow of the swastika, and a real emphasis on family protection, family safety. As our speakers have talked about, I make this pledge, I pay no more than top legal prices, I accept no ration goods without giving up ration stamps. Just to show you, my mom had a ration book. I own it now if anyone wants to see it later. It's totally amazing. And then the other artifact I just wanted to show you really quickly comes from my great aunt. And this is her Bible and Common Reader from 1944. And it has an insignia with a nice American eagle. Books are weapons in the war of ideas. And then it says, a wartime book. This complete edition is produced in full compliance with the government's regulations for conserving paper and other essential materials. There you go, a wartime book. So this, was a time, again, of intense public participation. And the kinds of I think the enormity of intimate everyday life being affected by the war, even for folks who were far away from theaters of war. And of course, as Rob and Amber have talked about in their presentations, mobilization also occurred through othering and racism. So there's this, as we've seen today so powerfully, the kind of demonizing and dehumanizing elements of propaganda as well. And we'll turn to some of that in a little bit. So the thing about all of this is that I think we have to remember is that on the eve of World War II, American society was hardly unified in any way, shape, or form. When we think about the isolationist movement, and there are many different strands of isolationism. We can turn to Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, but we can also pay attention to another isolationist movement that called itself the Mothers Movement, and they also called themselves America First, so that's a little confusing. And it was a group of mothers who they formed in California in 1939, and they surged after FDR signed the law authorizing the nation's first peacetime draft in US history on September 16th, 1940. And these mothers were steeped in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and they believed that a cabal of Jewish international bankers was leading New Dealers astray down a dangerous path of entangling internationalism that would lead to forever wars, and that men, fathers, and sons would be swept away from the home, leaving mothers in charge and kids in the streets and a society in chaos. That's basically what they thought would go on. They staged sit-down strikes, they staged all sorts of different kind of public displays of activism. A mother's crusade to defeat Bill 1776 for Lend-Lease. And they sat outside Senator Carter Glass's office, and they wouldn't leave because he was an internationalist, and they wanted him to know that they did not support him at all. And they softened their tone after Pearl Harbor, but they were very severely criticized. So we have Dr. Seuss being one of the excellent articulators of criticism against this mothers movement. So another form of kind of division and instability in American society at this time, of course, was its continuing struggles regarding racial and social justice issues. So racism still deeply endemic in American society, American life. And black leaders observed the irony of preparing to fight Hitler in a country that embraced Jim Crow racism. So the Crisis, the journal of the NAACP, declared a Jim Crow army cannot fight for a free world. So union activist A. Philip Randolph, and he was, a civil rights activist, he started planning with other civil rights leaders a March on Washington movement. They planned to go to Washington, D.C., roughly 100,000 people strong, to protest racism, Jim Crow divisions in the military, and the disparate levels in pay for black workers in what was becoming a burgeoning defense industry prior to US entry in the war. So Roosevelt got worried about this because he thought, 100,000 people marching on the Capitol, when we think we're trying to show the world that we're a unified country, optics aren't good. So he actually met with Randolph. He sent Eleanor Roosevelt to meet with him first because she had a very good rapport with civil rights activists, but he eventually meets with Randolph and they brokered a deal. So Randolph agreed to call off the march in exchange for guarantees of equal pay in the defense industries and also for guarantees of preventing discrimination in the defense industries on the basis of race, creed, religion, ethnicity. That was all something that was then codified in Executive Order 8802. And black activists called it the Second Emancipation Proclamation because it was that kind of amazing in terms of its, statements and what it was supposed to do. But racism persisted in the military and civilian society, and black newspapers were banned from military posts until 1946. The upshot was that with this ban on black newspapers, the reason for the ban was because black newspapers were fundamentally criticizing, again, the continuing sources of racism and inequality that persisted in the military, and focusing on the Double V campaign against racism at home and fascism abroad. So another factor, and then we're going to change gears in a moment, another factor of potential disunion on the eve of World War II, of course, was the continuing Depression. The Great Depression was an incredibly, overwhelmingly difficult experience for people. And in 1940, nearly half of Army enlistees were deemed to be unfit for military service owing to disabilities caused by malnutrition and the absence of good continuous health care. So this is a rough time. And the World War II era was the first time that all branches of the armed forces administered psychiatric examinations for everyone, people who were enlisting, people who were already enlisted. It was a pretty wholesale kind of examination process. And military psychiatrists were steadfast in insisting on removing men from service who didn't pass these psychiatric tests. And over 2 million people failed those psychiatric tests. So it was a very, pretty tough process. And I think as a testament to the potential kind of fragility of what morale, the state of morale on the eve of America's entry into war, and then the early year, 1941 December through 1942, these were treacherous times, as of course was true throughout the war. But in this time until September 1943, the Office of War Information, in consultation with the War Department, banned images of dead troops. And this does not change until September 20th, when Life magazine publishes the first images, dead Americans at Buna Beach. And this was a part of the Battle of Bunagona on the New Guinea campaign. And the interesting thing about this is that even this act of publishing this photograph, and then subsequently others, was also part of the propaganda campaign, because federal officials were worried that Americans on the home front were becoming too complacent about the war. Absenteeism was surging in the defense industries, and the summer of 1943 was a rough summer in terms of race rioting. The Zoot Suit riots occurred in California, in Los Angeles, and other locations around the country. So this is a society that is, very much, very tense. And so this kind of reasoning was to show and redouble people's commitment to what the stakes were in this ongoing war. So now we turn to the bait and switch. The vast oceanic theaters of World War II presented unique challenges to wartime morale. World War II placed more American service personnel into contact with the sea than at any prior conflict in American history. As Captain Dye stated yesterday, in regards to the Pacific War, the environment was the enemy just as much as the enemy was the enemy. And one of those enemies that receives outsized attention in popular culture as part of that environment was the presence of sharks. Okay, so it is incredible how much shark-related media is produced as a result of World War II. And the 4 species that we're talking about primarily are the shallows-loving bull shark. They can swim in fresh water, too, indeed. The tiger shark, known as the garbage can shark of the shark world, they can eat anything. They're attracted to anything. They prefer tropical seas, but they're pretty versatile sharks. And then we have the great white. This is a scene that you can't see much anymore in False Bay, South Africa, because the killer whales have arrived, and they've driven the white shark population out of False Bay. So it's an interesting ecological thing going on there. But that is like a submarine jumping out of the water. Those are big, wide, and fast fish. And then the oceanic white tip, which is a deep, deep water pelagic shark, also known as a shipwreck shark, because they would gather en masse at scenes of devastation. So keep that in mind. So I don't have time to talk about this right now, but maybe in the Q&A, if you have questions about the shark meat cuisine campaign that the federal government engaged in, or the shark liver oil boom to get sources of vitamin A for aviators' eyesight, or the flying tiger's nose art of the tiger shark, or Pearl Harbor and the role of the shark goddess in warning impending danger. All of this is what I'm researching. And so there's so much more. But anyway, I'm happy to talk about that later. But for now, I'm going to focus on morale and what federal officials did to try to change things and help things. So out of a population of 132.2 million people on the 1940 US Census, we have roughly 16.4 million people serving in the military, and we've got 15 million civilians crossing county lines. So these different mobilizations and movement of populations put people into contact with the ocean in lots of different environments. For example, we've got Miami Shipbuilding Center, also a place where troops were training. Guess what folks are doing? They're soaking it at the beach. And occasionally, they would encounter sharks. So one of the things we see is that sharks saturate wartime media. And you know, a meme didn't really exist at that time, but let's just call it what it is. The meme of shark-infested waters is omnipresent in media all over the place. And the constant reportage of action in the ocean was almost always accompanied by shark-infested waters, even if there were no sharks around. And here's just an example of that. On February 5th, 1943, the Washington, D.C. Evening Star reported that U.S. bomber pilot Lieutenant Wilmer Pavlach and his crew ran out of gas a mile off the coast of New Guinea. Remarkably, no one was really injured at all. They dove down, got their gear, came back up, and were really happy to call it a day, and they swam to shore. The newspapers reported battling shark-infested waters to get their gear, braving this treacherous scene. And indeed, it's treacherous to be out there. But in this case, and many others, no sharks. So we see sharks, though, in other places. We see them on ads for war stamps and war bonds, mobilizing people to give to buy war bonds, buy war stamps, support the war effort. Look at the dangers these brave people are facing. Stars and stripes. The fin is in the water. So the other thing, though, that we also see is a kind of transmogrification of shark-infested waters with descriptions of Japanese combatants. So there will be several newspapers that talk in the same story about shark-infested waters and the waters being infested with Japanese seaborne hordes, in the language of the Nome Nugget, in newspaper from Alaska in 1942, thus reproducing the xenophobic late 19th, early 20th century discourses of the kind of yellow peril and amplifying other aspects of racist propaganda, dehumanizing propaganda. So, reports from rescued castaways contained ominous descriptions of close encounters. During the Battle of Midway, from June 4th to 7th, 1942, 2 U.S. Navy pilots, Ensign John McInerney and Ensign John Magda, they ran out of gas. And they crashed over the open ocean before they could reach the safety of their aircraft carrier. They were together on a raft for 5 torturous days. Their lips split in the hot sun. They were so thirsty. And they were battling sharks at every turn. They recalled the break point on days 3 and 4. On the 3rd day, the morning sun was almost unbearable. We put our shirts over our heads, but it didn't help much. Most of the time, we were busy battling off sharks with our paddles. After a Japanese D-4Y Judy dive bomber dropped 2 bombs on the USS Princeton during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines on October 24th, 1944, surviving crew members swam among sharks for nearly 4 hours before they were rescued. But the biggest threat during the rescue was not so much the sharks, which were just kind of trolling around. It was the rescuers in the whaleboats who were peppering the surface of the water with machine gun fire and lobbing some grenades to get those sharks away. So that was a little bit of a dangerous situation. The violence of Jim Crowism compounded the trauma of shark-infested waters for Black military personnel during World War II. So Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender closely covered and celebrated acts of heroism among Black seamen, including the extraordinary valor of mess attendant Charles Jackson French, who swam through shark-infested waters on September 5th, 1942, for 6 to 8 hours near Guadalcanal, towing a raft of 15 injured white sailors who had survived the shelling of the USS Gregory in the Solomon Sea. In January 1943, the Chicago Defender named French its Hero of the Year. Similarly, the Chicago Defender highlighted the courage of merchant marine seaman George Nelson, who was adrift at sea for 39 days. So Nelson's story is really interesting. His ship was bombed, and he jumped off. He saw the raft, the life raft, like floating away, jumped off the side of the ship soon after the blast, swims to the life raft, gets it. Other people who are now in the water hop on this raft with him, and they are adrift at sea, as it says, for 39 days in shark-swarmed waters in the South Atlantic. They'd been torpedoed by a Nazi submarine. And rain kept coming in torrents. Schools of hungry sharks kept coming closer and closer. The raft made landfall on January 5th, 1943, on the Vichy-controlled island of Cayenne in French Guiana. Nelson was fluent in French, he was able to convince the Vichy officers to take them in and take care of them, which they did. And then, once they were well, sort of, they were returned to Miami. But in Miami, Nelson was denied entry into the same hotel with his raft mates because he was black. One of his white Southern mates from Mobile, Alabama, vigorously defended him. And this is what he said: "Yes, sir, that Southerner went to town. He told the Red Cross worker that we'd come miles and miles together through the shells and storms and winds with hunger in our bellies and sharks waiting to rip our flesh to shreds. He told her that we had taken the same chances and that we'd been treated like human beings, all of us, in every country but our own," unquote. He eventually returned to sea. Unfortunately, however, Charles Jackson French never recovered from the twin traumas of war and continuing lack of access to full equality. He was recommended for the Navy Cross, but he did not receive it. And he died very young at 37 from alcoholism in 1956. So definitely a rough life. So federal officials worried greatly about the perilous impact of shark fear on morale. Journalist Richard Tregaskis, his riveting best-selling account of his 2 months embedded with troops at Guadalcanal in 1942, contains several anxious references to the looming possibility of shark attack, although they didn't encounter any sharks, at least that he talked about. He said he couldn't even relax when they went swimming when there was a lull in fighting. He said the swimming was superb, but it would have been more enjoyable if it had not been so necessary to keep looking out for sharks. Sharks are the principal hazard of swimming in the salt water hereabouts. And the naval officer and marine scientist H. David Baldridge reported that fear of sharks was a major cause of poor morale among military service personnel in the Pacific Theater. Large schools were easily visible from the air and from boats as well, or from ships and aircraft carriers. And technology increased the possibility of a shark encounter. So we see, for example, we've got the P-38 Lightning here. This is a very, an important aircraft that adopted the use, as did other aircraft, of these drop tanks, which would increase distance that these aviators could fly over the vast stretches of the Pacific. And the other thing you can see is that clear bubble cockpit allows for good 360-degree views. And Richard Tregaskis, he described the marvelous vista of blue water and sky rolling by. And George Kenney, the 5th Army Air Force commander, General George Kenney, they totally remembered the morale-boosting potential of the P-38 because its twin engines was very reassuring to pilots flying these long stretches of 1,000 miles or so. Here's what he says. You look down from the cockpit, and you can see schools of sharks swimming around. They never look healthy to a man flying over them. Now, the P-38 is not a bad combat airplane, but the pilot arrives there 100%. He's just as good as when he took off because he knows one of those big fans can bring him home. And you hang gasoline on them. We put 3,000 gallons tanks on those wings. So it is in this broader context that sharks, as a trigger for wartime fear and trauma, became subjects of a national security campaign during World War II. The Office of Strategic Services collaborated with the US Navy and other branches of the armed forces to wage a sustained publicity campaign. As part of it, the OSS's Emergency Rescue Equipment section, they created fishing kits for seamen adrift, complete with fishing equipment and instructions on how to catch a range of fish, including sharks. And this was inspired by Eddie Rickenbacker's story of being adrift, and he was fishing and surviving, and also a Norwegian sailor who survived for 48 days on a raft by fishing. I just have to note something, being a circus person, bring them back alive. That's like Frank Buck, the animal trainer, who was very popular during this period. He was also a dealer. He was also a film star. But anyway, this brings them back alive. And so we also have instructions here as well. We also see other kinds of instructional pamphlets published. Castaway's Baedeker to the South Seas, which was a guide, a survival guide for servicemen stranded on Pacific islands, emphasizing the critical importance of conquering, quote, the bogeys of your imagination, such as, quote, if you are forced out at sea, a shark is sure to amputate your leg. Don't think that way. That was the thing. The best here, perhaps, is Shark Sense, which the US Navy published in 1944 and advised wounded airmen stranded at sea to, quote, staunch the flow of blood as soon as you disengage the parachute to thwart hungry sharks. The pamphlet also helpfully noted that hitting an aggressive shark on the nose might stop an attack. And another helpful bit of advice was that if you needed to, you could grab on to the pectoral or dorsal fins, hold on tight, and hang on as long as you can without drowning yourself. Sure. So the Office of Strategic Services' most sustained publicity campaign was initially, ironically, top secret. And it was a shark repellent development project. So Captain Harold Coolidge, a zoologist, OSS officer, he spearheaded the project after hearing about people who had been stranded at sea and then attacked by sharks. And he thought, that's terrible. What if they could survive, with a shark repellent? So he worked in conjunction with a whole bunch of other people, and he worked with Douglas Burden, a naturalist, also the owner of Marine Studios down in Florida, which made really fun dolphin films and such, and also Stuart Springer, a lay scientist and a shark liver fishery fisherman. He was very good and adept at catching sharks for the shark liver marketplace. And here is some of the outlined objectives of this program. A, background. Reliable reports from the Navy and the military intelligence and from the merchant marine indicate shark attacks have caused loss of life to our armed forces and merchant marine. The fear of being subjected to an attack of sharks is reported to have a persistently bad effect on morale. C, significance to national defense. It is desirable to afford some measure of protection to men in our armed forces and merchant marine who find themselves adrift in a lifebelt in shark-infested waters. The purpose of this protection is to remove as far as possible the menace of sharks and thereby to offset the undermining influence on morale. Okay, I better hurry up. So, the testing began. Springer tested concoctions of clove oil, horse urine, asparagus, rotting shark muscle to create a concoction that would repel sharks. None of them did the job. He came upon copper acetate and thought, maybe this will do it. Maybe this will do it. Seems pretty good. Until they actually tested it in the open water where it did nothing at all. So privately, he and his colleagues were pretty worried, like, this doesn't work. And he was especially worried, like, what happens if the sharks are in a wild mood, in a feeding frenzy? And he writes, actually, in a correspondence, it is this frenzied attack I fear more than any other. I am afraid it might one day happen. We have a loaded transport sunk in an area where there are already feeding sharks, and that the noise and other excitement will turn loose this slashing kind of attack, unquote. So what he thought, well, maybe, if there's a torpedo or strafing, whatever kind of attack, well, maybe right then and there you just start spraying the place with our shark repellent. And he said, nah, that's not going to work. So, owing to disruptions in supply chains, The shark repellent was not introduced until the very end of the war. News of it, however, had been leaked almost from the get-go. There were newspaper stories about, guess what, there's going to be a shark repellent. And then, once it was released, ultimately, practically, it was too late for a product that didn't work. But its cultural work had been done because it offered the possibility of morale-boosting hope of survival in a treacherous situation. So ultimately, and here it is, Shark Chaser. Ultimately, the US military's morale-boosting campaign was unable to vanquish the glaring reality of wartime carnage at sea. And Naval Reports correctly observes that sharks rarely bite healthy swimmers. And if you're injured already in the water, you're vulnerable to attack. And one of the most famous scenes of vulnerability and horror occurred after the bombing, the torpedoing of the USS Indianapolis on July 30th, 1945. I will say, in my research, I have found many other instances of similar situations at sea in which sharks are very much at the scene. And as we know, the heavy cruiser had just successfully delivered the components of the Hiroshima atomic bomb to Tinian Island on its top secret mission, and it was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Out of a crew of 1,196 men, 300 died immediately, and the rest landed in the water for nearly 5 days. And of those people who were in the water, only 316 men survived the ocean. And they're the survivors. Edgar Harrell was one of the lucky ones. His occupational success and stable family life made him a model of Tom Brokaw's greatest generation, but his wartime trauma never left him. Decades after surviving the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, he knew that any proximal encounter with the ocean was triggering. As the last living Marine survivor of the Indianapolis, and he passed away in 2021, Harold recalled, years later, while I was in Hawaii on a business trip, I decided to walk down to the edge of the ocean. But when I got close, I stopped and stared. It was as if though I was in a hypnotic trance. As I looked out at the open sea, suddenly I could see myself swimming. I could see sharks, the faces of shipmates, and bloated bodies. I could even hear men screaming. Finally, I realized I had to walk away. And to this day, I will never step foot in the ocean. Now, every veteran dealt with their trauma in their own way. Some other veterans dealt with this trauma by slaying the wartime monsters of their experience and of their imagination. And Frank Mundus, a fisherman, was at the helm of a thriving business catering to veterans on Montauk in Long Island, and he would take them out on first come, first serve boats, and they would go out and they would monster hunt sharks. The Long Island Special on the Long Island Railway took off from Penn Station, rolled out of there around 3:30 a.m., so after bar time, people could get their fishing gear, get on board, go out, fish all day, and then come back with their catch in a nice cooled compartment on ice. And Mundus one day, so this was kind of a therapeutic activity for a lot of veterans to go out and fish, go out and hunt these animals. So one day, it's June 1964, and he catches a huge white shark, 18 feet long, huge. I mean, it is just a large, large shark, and there's a lot of wrestling that occurs. He tows the shark. His customers are excited, tows this animal to shore, and as he's towing this animal to shore, the media shows up. There's newspapers. They're like, whoa, what is this monster from the deep that you have, pulled in? They wrote about it. And a young writer named Peter Benchley read the account of this incredible monster, and he clipped the story and put it in his wallet, where he would brandish it to people saying, I have an idea for a story. I have an idea for a story about a monster shark that arrives on the coast of a community and doesn't go away. And of course, this becomes what we know of as the book Jaws. But 30 years, and here we're wrapping it up, 30 years after the USS Indianapolis was torpedoed, the disaster was memorialized in the world's first summer blockbuster, Jaws, a film that Edgar Harrell refused to see. The film adaptation of Peter Benchley's best-selling novel told a harrowing story of a mammoth white shark hunting people off the coast of Amity. After several people are devoured, Amity's police chief, Martin Brody, an ichthyologist, Matt Hooper, and a crusty fisherman named Quint, very much modeled on Mundus, they hunt for the shark. Benchley's novel was effectively, really profoundly a Vietnam novel. It was a portrait of a roiling social turmoil, economic inequality, marital infidelity, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-war sentiment, environmental destruction, and sexual liberation. Dallas ISD banned the book from their libraries because it was so prurient, but kids loved to read it. By contrast, Steven Spielberg's film, he scrubbed it of contemporary content in favor of remembering World War II. In a haunting penultimate scene before he dies, Quint reveals that he is a survivor, and he talks about the days of bobbing at sea alongside sharks feasting on dead and dying men. And he later, hours later, becomes the final victim of the shark, thereby providing the penultimate conclusion to the film that is now celebrating its 50th anniversary. And this is a film that launches a wildly popular global shark culture industry. But Jaws and its pop cultural owes a great deal of debt to the extraordinary valor, courage, and trauma that defined America's and the world's time on the water during World War II. Thank you for listening.
All right. Do we have questions?
I have two questions. First of all, you mentioned that Charles Jackson French was put in for the Navy Cross. In the 90s, there was a big movement to go back and reevaluate African American service records and award those that deserved them. Mm-hmm. Was that done with Charles Jackson French?
It has not, to my knowledge. It's something that maybe I'll get involved in this because, yeah, it's quite a story.
And the second thing is, tell us about the shark meat campaign.
Oh my gosh, thank you for asking. Yes, so shark meat campaign. So it's connected to the shark liver oil boom. Okay, so I'll tell those two stories because they are connected to each other. So after Norway becomes effectively off limits to allied markets, the cod liver oil fisheries of that area, with the Nazis being there, that people are scrambling for other sources of vitamin A. And this had already begun even before 1940. But what happened was that American fishermen, including Stuart Springer, who was at the helm of the shark repellent campaign, they start fishing the waters, shark-rich waters off the coast of Florida, Santa Barbara, California, all over the world. And it is a boom industry. And so amid this thousands upon thousands of sharks, but what happened was that there were so much just refuse of sharks that was left to float in the sea because they would take out the livers, the fishermen, and they would take out fins to sell for the shark fin soup market. They would take out their eyes for making jewelry. Interesting. And teeth for, jewelry and souvenirs. All of this is to say that Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, he got in on it and he said, this is wasteful. We need to campaign to make people interested in eating these creatures because a nice shark fillet is just as good as a salmon fillet or halibut. Come on, people, eat them. So he tried. So that's what it was fundamentally about, was trying, in accord with the Office of Price Administration and rationing and food security mandates, trying to get people on board. It didn't work.
I wanted to make sure I was right about this. The PT-109 and sharks are linked through the 1943 sinking of the PT boat commanded by future President John F. Kennedy, who
Yes.
survived what he described as shark-infested waters. To
He
get to a
did!
small island.
Yes, yes, yes.
You're right on.
Yes, thank you for that. Oh, I know. AI generates some very interesting shark-related stuff, for sure.
To your knowledge, did the Japanese military have any sort of corresponding or similar efforts to immunize their sailors against the fear of shark attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question, too. I'll say that I have had a hard time finding Japanese records. I have seen some commentary from Japanese survivors of sinkings, and with the same kind of horror about being in the water. The thing is that, but nothing other than that. I have not heard anything about any kind of campaign. I know that, in terms of the rescue kind of infrastructure, they didn't have it in the same way that the Americans did. So, yeah, that more people who went in the water probably died in the water as well. Yeah.
Did you do any research on saltwater crocodiles?
Yes. So saltwater crocodiles were absolutely a part of this kind of complex aquaculture of monsters during World War II. I spent some time in Australia, up in Queensland, in North Queensland, and their records are filled with crocodile encounters. And I know I've read about this and other folks, we've been talking about this, that this was a major source of danger to Japanese troops as well, the crocodile encounters. And interestingly, so this is sort of a side note, but in North Queensland, some of the shark mitigation measures that some military folks did in the Australian service would be to slay crocodiles and use them as bait to catch sharks. So that was another, trying to control both of these predator populations in these estuarial and coastal regions. So, yeah.
Can you tell us anything about Julia Child's work?
Yes, I can. Thank you for that, Lauren. So, how many people have heard that Julia Child concocted the recipe for Shark Chaser? Yeah, there's a fair number. So, I actually thought that was the case too. I did. I thought it was because I think it was in around 2015, the CIA actually, the successor to the Office of Strategic Services, published some of their archival materials from the National Archives. And they, in these nice pieces, they had some parts of shark sense that they published. And they said, Julia Child created the recipe for Shark Chaser. And so that has lived on, and I thought, wow, okay, because she worked for the OSS. She worked for Harold Coolidge, whom I mentioned, who was at the helm of the shark repellent project. However, I'm terribly disappointed to tell you that I think it's kind of a, alligators in the sewers sort of urban legend, because I did a deep dive into those records. at the National Archives at College Park in Maryland. And she was never out on the boats or at Woods Hole in Massachusetts. She was not cooking in the kitchen, making delightful combinations of horse urine, clove oil, and nicotine, and asparagus. She was not involved. Although, speaking of AI-generated stuff, so this is fun, for some reason, I was looking up one of the bureaucratic strands of all these different agencies. World War II is a gigantic bureaucracy. This is something that's very, as all of you know, it's amazing how it all functions together. And so I was making sure that the Emergency Equipment Division was connected to the OSS, and it was, and I typed it in just to make positive sure, and then in the AI-generated answer that comes up at the top, it says, Julia Child invented shark repellent. That was its first thing that came up. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that little AI-generated perpetuation of this enduring myth. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.